So today we have joining us Professor Vesselin Popovski, who is currently the Vice Dean of Jindal Global University in India, but has also earlier been a Senior Academic Officer at the Director of Research and the Head of Peace and Governance Program at the UN University Tokyo. He's also, if I'm not wrong, been a former diplomat and is a renowned voice when it comes to issues related to international humanitarian law as well as international relations. Thank you so much, Professor Popovski, for speaking to India. Namaste. And thank you so much for allowing us to ask you some questions about what's happening right now in Israel and between the Israeli government and the Hamas armed groups. So just to start off a discussion, when we talk about international humanitarian law in the time of a war like we are seeing in the Middle East right now, what do you think are the main principles that the parties that are engaging in this armed conflict need to keep in mind? And how are those rules, if in your opinion, being violated right now?
Yes. First of all, the international humanitarian law has two major parts, so to speak. And one is the justification to use force, but also the conduct of war, what force can be used. And for that matter, it is important to divide the two, because one party can have a perfect justification saying that they have been occupied for 70 years and they have the right cause to fight, is not enough. You have a second part, which is the method of fighting, the way of fighting. You might have the best cause and say, I have been humiliated, I have been abused for many years, they occupy my territory. You might have excellent justification to fight, but if the method of fighting is terrorist, is killing women and children randomly, then somehow you lose also the first justification. And there are plenty of examples, you know. You can go back to the Irish Republican Army in Northern Ireland, where at some point, finally, fortunately, they changed the tactics. And this applied to Palestinian Liberation Organization. There were periods of time in history where the organization also did a lot of horrible terrorist acts. We remember 1972, the Olympic Games in Munich, when they abducted sports people from Israel and later killed them. They were not successful Israel was not successful in rescuing them. But at some point, and this is why Yasser Arafat got a Nobel Peace Prize, because he renounced the terrorist fighting. When the Palestinians denounce that, they become a partner in negotiation. When IRA in Northern Ireland renounce terrorism, they become a political negotiator. Before that, it's very difficult to accept that. On the other hand, we also know a history of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by the Israeli Defense Forces, most recently in 2014, when kind of an indiscriminate bombing of part of Gaza has produced what in the international humanitarian law we call excessive civilian suffering. And that is a violation of the international. So the military, when they undertake an operation, they have very carefully to consider the possibility of civilian suffering. What is called usually collateral damage is acceptable, but to a very minimal volume. Any excessive civilian suffering because of a military operation is regarded in international law as excessive, as violating the international humanitarian law. But we can say that already 6 days since last Saturday, since the attack by Hamas, we see, I will say, some restraint on behalf of Israel. Israel didn't send immediately its army into Gaza. They are cautioning people. They just gave another signal that they invite 1.1 million of the population of Gaza to move south, making clear that they're going to attack the north of Gaza. And they advise the population simply to drive 10 kilometers out, 15 kilometers out, and be safe there. They are not going to attack indiscriminately, but they're simply saying everybody who worries about their lives, and people would worry about that.
So let's take this step by step. So when you say that international humanitarian law is divided into two parts, I think what you're referring to is jus ad bellum and jus in bello, where the former deals with the conditions under which a party may have to resort to use of force or any kind of armed conflict, versus jus in bello, which determines the regulation of the conduct of the parties once they are already engaged in the armed conflict. So for the purposes of this discussion, we'll be focusing more on the second half about how the parties are conducting themselves.
The second part is called international humanitarian law. The first is called law of the armed conflict. Exactly.
Right. So keeping that in mind, do you think that the rules that have been laid down or the principles that have been laid down, especially regarding protection of civilians, regarding not taking hostages, because the kind of visuals that we've been seeing from on ground seem to be in complete violation of all principles of international humanitarian law?
Absolutely.
From both sides.
Yeah, what we see from Hamas is a violation of international humanitarian law par excellence. The way they murdered families in their homes, sleeping babies, women, and children, the way they abducted over 120 hostages. Hostage taking is prohibited. There is actually a separate convention on that as well. So what we have seen from Hamas is a blatant violation of international humanitarian law by far. What we actually call terrorism. Terrorism is an act which targets indiscriminate civilians, killing as many as possible, with the purpose to be in the media, to be in the news, and to send a message of frustration. And kind of all terrorists are the same. If you think of 9/11, Al-Qaeda did exactly the same. A brutal attack, and actually I would say even spectacular, some say mastermind. Osama bin Laden made a spectacular attack on the Twin Towers in New York. Exactly with the purpose to be famous, to be on the first page of the news, and somehow even to change the way we perceive international relations, connections between states. And here we have also some kind of attempt to terrorize Israeli people, civilians. But also, I think, again, it fits the definition of terrorism perfectly. And somehow the explanation of the Palestinian, of Hamas, not of Palestinian, we need to divide Palestinians from Hamas. Hamas is the terrorist organization. Not all Palestinians are like that. Actually, the majority of Palestinians also would probably condemn such conduct of war. We see that Hamas is absolutely equalizing itself as a terrorist organization. It has been already pronounced as such. And no doubt, so Hamas violates international humanitarian law. And on behalf of Israel, we see so far an attempt to comply with international humanitarian law. They are trying to minimize as much as possible the civilian damage in Gaza. They didn't take immediate action. They are sending warnings to the civilian population to evacuate. And that has been actually the way over time, including because of previous criticism. Israel has been criticized a lot, including in the famous Goldstone Commission in 2014. The report by the Goldstone Commission was also condemning Israel for committing excessive civilian targeting, which is a war crime. And for that matter, we see some restraint on behalf of the Israeli Defense Force at the moment. We'll see. We don't know. Maybe tomorrow, after tomorrow, we see another development. But so far, the fact that IDF did not brutally engage with military force in Gaza suggests that Israeli force is aware of international humanitarian law.
It's interesting that you say that it's the Hamas that's functioning from the Palestinian territory, which is blatantly violating all principles of international humanitarian law, despite the fact that Israel has not ratified the ICC treaty. whereas Palestine gives the jurisdiction to the ICC in areas of the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, along with Palestine. So how are we seeing the role of the ICC come into the picture here, especially considering that Israel has not conformed to following the rules or the jurisdiction of the ICC?
Excellent question. And the answer is that the Rome Statute for the ICC is ratified by states. And Hamas or Gaza is not a state actor. But the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court can also be activated by the prosecutor of the ICC if he or she finds evidence of war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, crime of aggression, and these are the four listed elements of crimes in the ICC. Yeah, Israel is not, and many other countries, by the way. United States, Russia, China, India is not part of the ICC. Many countries have reservations and prefer not to be part of it. By the way, I once argued that you better be inside the ICC because your soldiers might not be rescued if there is a arrest warrant and someone is captured and delivered to The Hague, then only you can apply, only a member, a state party of the ICC can apply the Article 17, which suggests that domestic investigation and prosecution come first. So, but again, my kind of academic legal argument doesn't move anybody. Parliaments in those countries are reluctant to ratify the ICC, being mostly concerned that their soldiers should not end up in The Hague. And the truth is exactly the opposite. If you are not a state party, then your soldier might end up in The Hague. You cannot rescue them.
Quite ironically.
But Israel is not, as all those countries I mentioned, and we understand why Israel is not. Israel generally is against international law. They see, for example, United Nations as, because the majority of the countries in the United Nations are Arab and Muslim, and from the global South, African, Asian, and they regard many organs in the UN, the Human Rights Council, the Security Council. There were resolutions by the General Assembly. There were many resolutions by the General Assembly accusing Israel of occupying illegally the territory of Palestine. But Israel generally regards this as kind of a Western, not actually Western, Arab or Muslim conspiratorial resolutions, and they regard United Nations as not representative enough, which in fact is exactly the opposite. You know, you have an organization with 193 members, and the majority decide whatever that majority could be. But that explains exactly your question, why Israel is not part, because they generally doubt and disregard international law, including the
At the same time, when you say that Hamas is a non-state actor, does that mean that they are not obligated by the principles of international humanity?
Oh, yes, they're absolutely obligated. Any person, even not an organization, committing a crime could be delivered to justice. Yes, war crimes are committed by individuals. Crimes against humanity are committed by individuals. Of course, the leaders usually order those crimes, and the regular can file soldier execute those crimes. So yes, Hamas is not, what I meant is that Hamas is not a state to join any agreement in international law, including International Criminal Court. So non-state actors are not signing and ratifying their own statute for the ICC. But as I mentioned, the prosecutor can take cases, can activate the cases.
In situations like this, how much of a responsibility do you think lies on the state itself, that once the crisis has been averted, to actually bring to justice the victims that have been harmed, or prosecute those that are accused of war crimes within the state, the local courts and their jurisdiction? How much of a responsibility lies on them? Because like you said, the ICC might not be able to do much.
Well, the ICC did actually, the jurisdiction of the ICC was activated by Uganda, by Congo, and investigations and prosecution did happen. Yes, not surprisingly, it is with the rebel forces, Lubanga case and others, where the government brings the situation to the ICC with the invitation, basically say, we don't have a proper legal system, it's a country after civil war, please come and help and investigate and prosecute those leaders of the rebel forces that fought against the government. So that's one way to do that, but obviously Israel is not a state party, it cannot do the same. But when the states do not do that, as I mentioned, then there are two other options. The Security Council can activate the jurisdiction. It happened twice against several individuals, including the former president of Sudan, Omar Bashir, with Security Council Resolution 1539 referring Omar Bashir and others to the ICC. And also it happened with Muammar Gaddafi in Libya with Resolution 1970 in 2011. He couldn't end in the tribunal, and that's, by the way, very paradoxical. I wrote at the time, the only safe place for Muammar Gaddafi would have been The Hague in Netherlands. If he took a helicopter, went to surrender to The Hague in Netherlands, he would have been today, in 2023, Muammar Gaddafi would have been alive in a nice prison in Sweden or Norway, but he would have been alive. So that's the paradox of international criminal justice. And those people, they don't think that way, that they could be murdered tomorrow by those rebels they're fighting. Exactly what happened with Muammar Gaddafi. So there are successful stories of international criminal justice, and not only those. We remember also universal jurisdiction, Hissène Habré, the former dictator of Chad, being prosecuted and sentenced by a court in Senegal. The Kenyan former President Kenyatta, he personally went to The Hague to defend himself successfully, and he was acquitted. So the right approach here could be that if somebody really pretends and speaks he or she is innocent, the best way not to speak to the media, the best way is to go to The Hague and prove to the judges that that person is innocent and go back home free. That exactly happened with the Kenyan.
The biggest challenge with international law in general, and then also international humanitarian law, seems to be that it depends a lot on the willingness of the parties to subject themselves to that jurisdiction. So what happens when the parties don't agree to do that? What are the options available for the civilians who've lost their lives, lost their properties? Is it just local jurisdictions that they then have to go and fight for justice?
Again, if we talk about Israel and Gaza, there are not many options, but I did a lot of work with the European Court of Human Rights. So in the bombing of Kosovo, of Yugoslavia, because of Kosovo in 1999, several of the victims of the Serbian civilians who were killed by the NATO bombing in Belgrade, in specific the bombing of the TV station, the TV tower in Belgrade was destroyed by NATO bombing. 17 people died. And one of them, the family of one of them, couldn't make it to The Hague in the International Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, but under the Human Rights Court, the European Court of Human Rights, they were successful in filing a case against 16 members of the Council of Europe, which also are members of NATO, who participated in the operation, and they got a compensation. Again, not much, unfortunately, for the Palestinians here, because the country Israel is not part of the European Court. But there are usually mechanisms where victims of human rights violations can appeal under the mechanism of the United Nations Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, and other mechanisms. Yes, human rights violations have to be reported and have to be dealt with the mechanisms of the United Nations.
I want to also ask you a little bit about doctrine of proportionality, because I believe that under the international law, it is presumed that there will be some collateral damage, like you said. There'll be some civilian lives lost, there'll be some civilian property that's destroyed. But all of that needs to be measured in terms of the doctrine of proportionality. So can you explain a little bit to our viewers how the doctrine of proportionality works and under what circumstances is it okay to attack civilians or civilian properties?
Excellent question again. Thank you, Nalini. Proportionality is a major part of the deliberation and the evaluation whether it's a war crime or not. You are right. The threshold there is called military advantage. Can the military prove that the military advantage of what they did correspond to non-excessive civilian damage? I can give you good examples, like the one I mentioned in Kosovo is a good one, because in one situation, there was a bombing of a bridge where a train passed, and the pilot whose task was to bomb the bridge, because the bridge is military target. You can destroy bridges, no problem, unless there are civilians at the time when you bomb the bridge. So the pilot goes, he drops the bomb, but suddenly a train came to the bridge and he hits the train. The first two cars are damaged, several people die. But because of the train, he couldn't destroy the bridge. And the pilot goes back to hit again to destroy the bridge. To complete the military mission, the pilot decides to hit second time. The first hit is not a war crime, because his task is to destroy the bridge, and by random chance, the train happens to come at the same second. But the second hit is a war crime, because he should have known, he should have seen that there are already cars of the train being hit, and there are civilians there. So it's interesting that the first is not, the second is. Another example, if you want, of proportionality, and that's usually I give that to my student. What do we consider military target? That's the other question to answer. And I usually say a driver of munitions in the front line of a battlefield, is he a military target? He's a civilian driver. He basically drives a truck full of rockets. And the answer to that question is the driver is not a military target, but the truck is. So as a military commander, you need to destroy the truck with the rockets, and you do that. But if you can spare the life of the driver, that's the way to do that.
So there has to be a continuous
If the
ongoing
driver
assessment.
dies, it's a collateral damage. It is acceptable under international humanitarian. So you destroy the truck, all rocket explodes, and if the driver survives, don't kill him. But if the driver dies because of the explosion, obviously a collateral damage.
So what I understand is that there has to be a continuous assessment of the situation to determine what kind of a military advantage you're getting and whether or not that trumps the civilian lives.
That's back to the case in Belgrade.
Yeah.
The discussion in the prosecution and the defense actually argue whether the TV tower is a military target. NATO did give a warning that they are going to bomb the tower. Civilians should have evacuated. But also the argument of the defense was that they stopped the TV station operating for 12 hours. Well, after 12 hours, the TV renewed its broadcast. So really, is it so important to stop the military propaganda of the enemy only for 12 hours to hit the tower station and kill 17 people? Some people will argue, no, it's not enough military advantage as to justify the hit on the TV tower.
Another aspect I want you to clarify for us is hostage take and what the international law says about taking hostages, because those are, I think, one of the most horrific visuals that we are seeing coming in from Israel, where there are women, children that are being kidnapped and they're being taken as hostages. Some of them are being killed, others are being detained. So what does the international law say about parties to an armed conflict taking hostages?
Well, definitely international law condemns that. Hostage taking is prohibited. In a special separate convention on hostage taking, many states ratified it, over 150. There is also a convention on civil aviation, because very often in the past there were hostage taking by, and including, by the way, by the Palestinians. In 1976, Palestinians took hostage a full airplane, Israel airplane in Entebbe, airport Entebbe in Sudan, was hijacked with can't remember how many, but a lot of Israeli civilians being on board of the plane. And the Palestinians hold that plane for several hours. And by the way, the Israeli Special Force, with a rescue mission, invaded another country. And that's a good answer to your question. Rescuing hostages abroad in Entebbe crisis, Entebbe airport, was considered by international law to be acceptable. They didn't say it's legal because it's still an intervention into the territorial integrity and sovereignty of another country. In fact, Uganda, Entebbe was in Uganda. Idi Amin, the leader of Uganda, protested that. He said it's an intervention against the territorial sovereignty, but the international law did not regard it as intervention if the purpose of the action was only humanitarian and only rescuing hostages in the airport, which was a successful operation by the Israeli. Again, this time it might not work because the hostages are, as we understand, put into the tunnel underground. It's not easy to identify them. So the only way here is to negotiate in exchange. And it's, by the way, very often happens. The exchange of prisoners of war often happens in armed conflict, including by big enemies, by the way. It happened during the Second World War between Nazi and Soviet. I'm sure it also happened several times between Russian and Ukrainian prisoners of war could be exchanged. And it happened many, many times between Israeli and Palestinians. Israel is very happy to rescue even a single soldier and release from its prison Palestinian prisoners of war. I'm sure there are such discussions, and I heard that Egypt and Qatar, two countries, and they operate as mediators here because Qatar can talk to Hamas and Egypt can talk to Israel, and Qatar and Egypt can talk between them. So that channel of negotiations to release hostages is open, but we don't see so far. Apparently, Hamas is using the hostages as yet another pressure to fight. They basically say we were going to kill the hostages if Israel start bombing without warning civilian targets, and they can consider civilian targets to be anything in Gaza. Hamas may say it's a civilian target, even if it is not. So it's a very difficult hostage situation, totally prohibited, as I say, in international law, but the examples are quite interesting also to remember.
Another aspect that I want you to discuss is humanitarian access. Now, the fact that Israel says that they are going to cut off all basic essentials, that people in the Gaza Strip, civilians that might have nothing to do with the armed conflict that's going on, the fact that fuel is running out in Gaza, their medicines, food, water is dangerously low. Do you think this is acceptable for humanitarian access to be cut out for civilians? And how much of a role does Israel have to play in ensuring that this does not
happen? Okay, let's be specific. Probably the only justification can be found to a certain extent on internet and electricity, but definitely food, water, medicine are prohibited. And by the way, this is the way at the time of big invasions, usually Genghis Khan, when he invaded, that the siege of a city or town and stopping any supply was the way to make the enemy surrender. So what Israel is trying to do is saying, yes, we are cutting the supply, expecting hostages to be given us back. So because we violated that international law and took hostages, give us back the hostages and we will immediately resupply electricity, water, food, and medicine. Okay, if I was an Israeli commander, I will cut only the electricity, because water and medicine and food are basic human needs. Everybody, every child, every elderly needs those. Electricity, probably you can cut for some time, temporary, for 48 hours. Nobody will die without electricity for 48 hours. But the rest is really dangerous. And but again, they may decide to resupply water and food. But actually, another question comes to mind. And this is more historical here. Why Palestinians need food to be delivered from Israel? And that's a very crucial question. What does Hamas do for 20 years in Gaza so that Gaza doesn't produce food, but produce rockets and weapons? So that is crucial.
And one might argue that Hamas has been involved
Hamas is the authority of Gaza for 20 years, 18 years. If they did a proper management of that part, people in Gaza would have lived exactly like people in Israel would have lived, with all the food, all the medicine, all the pharmacies there. They did not. And asking Israel to give them the food every day is not a long-term solution here. You need a proper authority and not a terrorist authority in Gaza. And I must say something which might sound very radical. The best outcome for the Palestinians in Gaza is Hamas to be destroyed by Israel. It really sounds radical, but I see it only this way. Once Hamas is militarily destroyed in Gaza, this is when the Palestinians in Gaza will be liberated from a brutal, totalitarian, murderous regime. So the victims in Gaza are actually victims of Hamas. They are not victims of Israel.
But don't you think there needs to be a differentiation between the armed groups of Gaza versus, say, the political or the administrative groups that function in the area, but might not necessarily be involved in armed conflict or have anything to do with these attacks? I mean, can Hamas be categorized as just one large group is my question.
We don't see that. Hamas is not a proper authority. They came by bloody coup d'etat. Fatah, the Palestinian authority, which is in the West Bank, is the proper authority, actually. They are not terrorists. We have a good example, if you want. Fatah is not a terrorist organization, and in West Bank, they don't do what Hamas does in Gaza. But here we have a terrorist occupier. So I'll say, who occupies Gaza? It's not Israel. Israel left Gaza in 2005. Gaza is occupied by Hamas, and Hamas is torturing the Palestinians in Gaza. But somehow they don't understand it, because from very little child, in the first years in their life, in the schools, they are told the big enemy is Israel, we need to fight Israel. If every little boy in Gaza is told that his purpose of life is to fight Israel, what else can you expect?
On that note, thank you so much, Professor Popovski, for speaking to us. I promised you 20 minutes. I think I've taken 30. I'll apologize for that. And I hope we can have another detailed discussion about this soon as things progress in the Middle East. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
Namaste.
Thank you.